Unit 2. Exercise 1. The purity of recycled products plays a key role in explaining the strength of demand for them. One of the reasons for the high rate of aluminum recycling and the much lower rate of plastics recycling is the differential difficulty with which a high-quality product can be produced from discarded materials. Whereas bundles of aluminum cans have a relatively uniform quality, waste plastics tend to be highly contaminated with non-plastic substances or with plastics of very different types, and the plastics manufacturing process has little tolerance for impurities. Remaining contaminants in metals can frequently be eliminated by high-temperature combustion, but plastics are destroyed at such high temperatures. Finally, waste that contains hazardous materials, such as mercury and lead, raises additional complexities. The rapidly growing stream of electronic waste, e-waste, contains both hazardous waste and valuable minerals, creating complicated dilemmas. Markets for discarded electronics in industrializing countries may lack good enforcement mechanisms to ensure proper disposal of the hazardous components. Exercise 2. Swift geographical expansion was one of the factors that undermined democracy in the Middle East. Early democracy in pre-Islamic Arabia, as in many other human societies, was a small-scale, face-to-face affair. Elders from individual tribal groups would assemble, discuss, and reach some sort of a conclusion. The process was an informal one, precisely because the circumstances allowed for informality. With the Islamic conquests, the question was posed of how to govern not in a face-to-face setting, but instead across distances of hundreds and even thousands of miles. Some scholars have suggested that in this situation, what was needed was the practice eventually adopted by Europeans, a form of political representation that could allow for democratic governance over large distances. But Europeans took centuries of trial and error to arrive at this solution. The inhabitants of the Islamic world would have needed to figure this out within a matter of decades. Exercise 3. One can fully understand a physical process, like the spider's web weaving, without being a spider, without ourselves being in a position to engage in this process, and so without knowing what it feels like to perform the activity. But one cannot fully understand a cognitive process like color vision or symbol interpretation or anger without experiencing that sort of thing. It is one thing to explain how operations originate, and another to know what it is like to perform them. The physiology of inebriation can be learned by everyone, but only the person who drinks can comprehend it in the inner, experiential mode of cognitive access. The mental performances that reflect meaning and purpose can be understood only from within the orbit of experience, though their occurrence can doubtless be detected and accounted for through external scientific causal examination. Talk of meaning, intending, purposing, and the like is bound to experience, to performer's perspective, and thus differs from the neurophysiology of brain processes, which is wholly accessible to external observers. Exercise 4. Over the centuries, notions of privacy have constricted in reaction to advancing technology. Taking people's pictures in public spaces without permission is not a legal invasion of privacy. What the Google Maps camera catches as it drives by, collecting images for Google Street View, is also not a violation. But spaces behind tall fences, shuttered windows, and closed doors are still in the realm of physically private spaces. Public space has been traditionally considered to be space where an individual voluntarily ventures out, with the knowledge that what he or she shares there physical form and any utterance, transaction, or expression is accessible by unknown members of a mass audience. One may not expect to be captured by Google Maps while retrieving the morning paper from the front steps, but a person who ventured out the front door knows that he or she is visible to others. Going out into public in the physical world provides consent to be viewed. Exercise 5. Franz Boas, the founder of American anthropology, was among the first scientists to challenge the taxonomic approach to human biological variation. Specifically, he wanted to test the widely held notion that head shape and other so-called racial markers were static entities, essentially unchanging through time. In the early 1900s, he and his researchers studied some 18,000 immigrant families, calculating the cephalic index, the ratio of head length to head breadth, of parents born in Europe and of their children born in the United States. The results of this study revealed that the adults' and children's head shapes differed, not by a lot, but by a degree that could be expressed mathematically. This finding undermined the idea, prevalent at the time, that racial types were innately stable, because the differences that had been cited among various races were not unchangeable. Boas concluded that the race concept was invalid. Boas's work laid the foundation for a scientific focus on biological process rather than on typological classification. Exercise 6. It is important to realize that policymakers do not have very much information at the time when they must make policy decisions. For instance, the Consumer Price Index is available only with a 1-month lag, so our knowledge of inflation is always running a month behind the actual economy. The GDP, Gross Domestic Product, is even worse. The GDP data are available only quarterly, and we do not find out about GDP until well after a quarter ends, and even then substantial revisions to the numbers often occur many months after the quarter. The point is simply that the Federal Reserve, the Monetary Policy Committee, and other policy-making institutions must formulate policy today on the basis of less than complete knowledge of the current situation, and the policy must be addressed to a best guess of the future situation. It is like trying to drive a car looking only in the rearview mirror. You can see where you have been, but you must make decisions about where you will go next without knowing exactly where you are currently. Exercise 7. The laser is an example of the underrating of the practical implications of a scientific discovery. When Arthur Schawlow and Charles Townes published their seminal paper describing the principle of the laser in Physical Review in 1958, it produced considerable excitement in the scientific community and eventually won them Nobel Prizes. However, neither these authors nor others in their group predicted the enormous and diverse practical implications of their discovery. Lasers, apart from their many uses in science, have enabled the development of fast computers, target designation in warfare, communication over very long distances, space exploration and travel, surgery to remove brain tumors, and numerous everyday uses. Barcode scanners in supermarkets, for example. Schawlow frequently expressed strong doubts about the laser's practicality, and often quipped that it would be useful only to robbers for safe-cracking. Yet advances in laser technology continue to make news to this day. Exercise 8. Virtual reality, VR, is a simulated experience of the real world in which individuals can interact with an artificial three-dimensional environment using electronic devices. Its close cousin, Augmented reality, AR, refers to the enhancement of the real world using computer-generated perceptual information, such as overlaying digital imagery onto the real world. Taken together, they are known as immersive technologies that may completely change how we experience journalism. Their power lies in their transformative storytelling capabilities. They help provide viewers with a more accurate physical representation of space, spatial relationships, sense of spatial presence, and experienced immersion. The well-known VR film producer Chris Milk, who created a film that puts viewers inside a refugee camp, said the technology is an ultimate empathy machine that connects humans to other humans in a profound way I've never before seen in any other form of media, and it can change people's perception of each other. This statement is backed by some empirical research that suggests that VR can increase the empathy of viewers and their perception of the credibility of news. That's why these technologies have been considered as the new frontier of journalism. Exercise 9. Managed forests are second-growth forests that have been planted, thinned, fertilized, and sprayed with pesticides, just like a farmer's field. One of the first things you notice when you walk in a managed forest is that the trees are smaller than in an old-growth forest, and the forest looks mostly brown instead of green. This is because the trees are all the same age, the same size, and the same height. The trees grow close together, and very little light gets through their branches. This means that there aren't any berry bushes or other plants on the forest floor because they can't get enough light to grow. Because the trees are so young, they don't have any mosses growing on them. Without the nurse logs and snags and diversity of plants, there is less habitat available for wildlife. We can still hear birds chirping high up in the canopy, but overall there is much less biodiversity in a planted second-growth forest. Exercise 10. The fact that emotions are unlearned, automated, and set by the genome always raises the specter of genetic determinism. Is there nothing personal and educable about one's emotions? The answer is that there is plenty. The essential mechanism of the emotions in a normal brain is indeed quite similar across individuals, and a good thing too, because it provides humanity in diverse cultures with a common ground of fundamental preferences on the matters of pain and pleasure. But while the mechanisms are distinctly similar, the circumstances in which certain stimuli have become emotionally competent for you are unlikely to be the same as for me. There are things that you fear that I do not, and vice versa. Things you love and I do not, and vice versa. And many, many things that we both fear and love. In other words, emotional responses are considerably customized relative to the causative stimulus. In this regard, we are quite alike, but not entirely. Exercise 11. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim advocated functionalism. Durkheim was the first to promote science as a basis for making sociological decisions. Rooted in the French political and social upheaval from 1870 to 1895, Durkheim believed changes in social institutions and quality of life occurred through political reform and scientific advances. He was the first to suggest that to understand an individual, one must not look at the individual, but rather at the society or group in which that individual is a member. Durkheim believed society was greater than its individuals, and that society's components had tremendous power to shape and influence human behavior. He believed individualism and self-interest threatened the cohesion of social institutions and undermined the authoritative nature of group life. As a result, individual autonomy came at the expense of the good of the collective forces. Consequently, Durkheim was an advocate of moral education due to his concern with increasing individualism. He advocated that society's different components comprise a collective conscience that affects individual thought and behavior for the good of the whole. Exercise 12. Simplifying an explanation, description, or argument is not always a bad thing to do. In fact, it can be very useful. To truly understand a physical phenomenon, to reveal its essence, the scientist will attempt to strip away the unnecessary detail and expose its bare bones, always as simple as possible, but no simpler. For example, laboratory experiments are often carried out under specially controlled conditions to create artificial and idealized environments that make the important features of a phenomenon easier to study. Unfortunately, this hardly ever applies when it comes to human behavior. The real world is messy and often far too complicated to simplify. There is a well-known joke, to physicists at any rate, about a dairy farmer who wishes to find a way of increasing the milk production of his cows, and so seeks the help of a team of theoretical physicists. After carefully studying the problem, the physicists finally tell him they have found a solution, but that it only works if they assume a spherical cow in a vacuum.